There is a photograph taken on the eastern bank of the river Rhine on the afternoon of March 7, 1945. In it, a young American second lieutenant from a small farming town in Nebraska is standing on a cratered iron railway span. He has just walked across that span under machine gun fire. Beneath his boots are fragments of cable, splinters of bridge tie, and the unexploded remnants of about 2,800 kilograms of demolition charges that the German engineers underneath had been ordered to detonate. They had pulled the switch. The switch did nothing. For the next 10 days, the army that had failed to bring this bridge down would attempt one of the most desperate, frantic, and ultimately doomed efforts to destroy a single piece of infrastructure ever recorded in modern war. They would fire 11 V-2 ballistic missiles at it from a launch site in the occupied Netherlands. They would aim a 600mm siege mortar called Karl at it. They would float underwater swimmers down the river toward it. They would launch over 360 different German aircraft at it in 10 days of continuous bombing. None of it would work. And on March 10, 1945, 3 days after this photograph was taken, a 60-year-old field marshal who was being moved from the Italian front to take over the entire collapsing western front of the Reich would walk into his new headquarters, look at his stunned staff officers, and introduce himself with one of the strangest sentences any senior officer would utter for the entire duration of the Second World War. He would say, "Well, gentlemen, I am the new V3. The same man, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, would later let slip a phrase about what had happened at this bridge that no German officer at his level was supposed to say in public. He would call it a crime, the crime of Remagen. The strange thing is not that he said it. The strange thing is what those two phrases, taken together, actually meant. To call yourself the new V3 was to compare yourself to a vengeance weapon, the third of Hitler's so-called retaliatory weapons, after the V-1 cruise missile and the V-2 rocket. The V-3 was a long-range pressurized cannon designed to drop shells on London from a hardened bunker in occupied France. It was a weapon for a regime that had run out of other options. To call Remagen a crime was something far stranger. It was to suggest, very quietly, that the people guilty of that crime were not the Americans who had captured the bridge, but someone else. Who that someone else was, and why a German field marshal would let those two phrases out of his mouth in the same week of March 1945, is the story this entire investigation turns on. Because what happened at Remagen was not, in the end, a story about an American victory. It was a story about a German military machine that had spent the previous 5 years devouring its own officers from the inside. By the time an American lieutenant walked across that bridge, the men who should have brought it down had been turned into something they were never meant to be. Hesitating, paralyzed by the chain of command above them, executed afterward by their own side. This is the story of how a regime that had once produced the most adaptable army in Europe ended its war by shooting 4 of its own officers for failing to obey orders that no rational chain of command could have processed in the time available, and of why a field marshal sent in to hold the line, looking at what had been done to those men, allowed the word crime to leave his lips. To understand what happened on the Rhine that March, we have to go back not to Remagen, but to a different bridge in a different city, 5 months earlier, and to the moment that began the slow strangulation of the German officer corps from the top down. The city was Cologne. The bridge was the Mülheim Bridge, a long suspension span of about 315 meters that connected the eastern and western halves of the city across the Rhine. On the night of October 14 and into the morning of October 15, 1944, a flight of American bombers struck Cologne in 2 heavy daylight raids. One of the bombs found a chamber inside the structure of the Mülheim Bridge, the chamber where German engineers had stored the demolition charges meant to bring it down in the event of an Allied advance. The bomb detonated those charges. The bridge collapsed into the Rhine, prematurely, accidentally, by no German order at all. Hitler was furious. The military logic of the situation was uncomplicated. A bomb had found a charge, and there was nothing for any human officer to have done differently. But Hitler was no longer interpreting events through military logic. He had been losing trust in his generals continuously since the failed July 20 bomb plot, less than 3 months earlier, in which a small group of officers had tried to kill him with a briefcase bomb at his East Prussian headquarters. He had grown convinced that the destruction of bridges the loss of cities, the failures along the front were not the consequences of a war Germany was clearly losing, but the consequences of treason and incompetence among the men charged with carrying out his orders. The Mülheim collapse, in Hitler's mind, was not an accident. Someone had to be punished. And so, in the second half of October 1944, an order went out across the Wehrmacht that would later become the single most important reason a bridge at Remagen was still standing on the afternoon of March 7, 1945. From that day forward, no demolition charges were to be physically placed on a Rhine bridge until enemy forces were within 8 kilometers, about 5 miles, and no charges, once placed, could be detonated without a written order from the senior officer in the defensive sector. Any officer who blew a bridge too early would be court-martialed. Any officer who failed to blow a bridge in time would also be court-martialed. This was the trap closing. To understand why the trap was so cruel, you have to understand what the German army had been before it became this, because the very system that Hitler was now strangling had been, only a few years earlier, the most envied military command structure on earth. It had a German name, Auftragstaktik, mission command, and entire armies in other countries had spent the interwar years trying to copy what the Germans were doing. The principle was simple. A captain in the field was not given a detailed plan. He was given an objective and a commander's intent, and he was trusted to figure out how to accomplish it. A regimental commander who heard a radio order from above that no longer fit the situation in front of him was expected to disregard it and do what the order had been meant to achieve. By the autumn of 1944, that principle had quietly stopped functioning in the places that mattered most. It had not been killed by a manual or a directive. It had been suffocated by something more insidious, the slow accumulation of fear inside the officer corps, the realization that initiative was no longer being rewarded but punished. The man who acted on his own judgment now faced a tribunal. The man who waited for orders, even orders that came too late, at least had a piece of paper saying he had done what he was told. By the autumn of 44, every officer in the Wehrmacht was making a calculation that no German officer of 1940 would have understood. He was choosing the safer career path, which meant choosing not to think. This was the system that took delivery of one of the most strategically important pieces of infrastructure in the closing months of the war. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was a remnant of an older war. It had been built between 1916 and 1919, partly by Russian prisoners of war captured on the Eastern Front of the First World War, and named for the German general Erich Ludendorff, who had championed its construction. It was a railway bridge, 3 iron spans, 2 railway tracks side by side and pedestrian walkways on either edge, anchored at each bank by 2 massive stone towers that looked more like medieval keeps than modern engineering. The eastern end ran straight into a tunnel cut through a vertical cliff called the Opella Lay, which rose about 450 feet above the river. The steel structure of the bridge was about 325 meters long. Counting the stone approach overpasses on each side, the total span was closer to 400 meters. The Rhine at this point was about 300 meters wide. By March 1945, with all the other Rhine bridges south of Bonn either already destroyed by retreating Germans or struck by Allied bombs, the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had become, almost by accident, one of the last intact crossings of the Rhine in the entire Western theatre. The Germans defending it, on paper, looked like a bridge garrison. In reality, by the morning of March 7, they were a collection of patches and improvisations. The bridge security company under Captain Willi Bratge had 36 convalescing soldiers, some of whom could not even physically fire a rifle. The engineer company responsible for the actual demolition charges was led by Captain Karl Friesenhahn, an older officer whose unit consisted of about 120 men, mostly veterans of the First World War, who had been called back into uniform decades after they had thought they were done. Around these professional units were attached 180 boys from the Hitler Youth, 200 Luftwaffe ground crew assigned as anti-aircraft gunners, 20 men from a rocket battery, 120 Eastern troops, mostly former Red Army prisoners of doubtful loyalty, and roughly 500 civilian Volkssturm, about 1,000 men in total. Many had never fired a weapon at an enemy. On the night of March 6, 14 of the anti-aircraft crewmen simply walked away. Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer, had a job that was theoretically straightforward. When the order came, he was to detonate the charges in the bridge piers and bring the structure down. He had asked for 600 kilograms of military-grade explosive. He received 300 kilograms of an industrial-grade compound called donerit, a much weaker civilian product used in mines and quarries. He placed the donerit on the southeast pier. The plan was to fire the main charge electrically from a switch inside the railway tunnel on the east bank, with a manually lit fuse cord as a backup if the electrical system failed. What he did not have, on the morning of March 7, was a clear chain of command above him. The day before, the cavalry general responsible for the entire Remagen sector, Edwin Graf von Rothkirch und Track, had wandered into American lines while travelling between commands further west in the Eifel Hills, and had been captured. His replacement was named at 1 a.m. on the morning of March 7, and that replacement, General Otto Hitzfeld of the LXV-7 Corps, was so far from Remagen that he had to dispatch his own adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, to drive 64 kilometers through ground crawling with American tanks, with a radio team of 8 men to take command on the spot. Scheller's car ran low on fuel. He had to detour to refuel. He arrived at the bridge at 11:15 on the morning of the attack. The American spearhead reached the heights overlooking the river only 3 hours later. Scheller had no time to assess the position, no time to organize the defenders he had inherited, no time to verify the demolition arrangements. What he did have, etched into him by every directive that had come down the chain of command since October, was a single overriding instruction. Do not blow the bridge until the enemy is in sight. Do not blow it without written authorization. If you blow it too soon, you will be court-martialed. So when Captain Bratge came to him at 1 in the afternoon and asked for permission to demolish the structure, Scheller said no. The Americans were not yet visible. There were still German vehicles trying to cross. A young Luftwaffe officer arrived at the western end with a column of trucks carrying what was, he said, a top-secret rocket weapon, and pleaded for time to get his battery across before the bridge was destroyed. Scheller gave him time. By 2 in the afternoon, American infantry were entering Remagen on the western bank. By 2:30, Scheller and Friesenhahn were on the bridge itself, looking back, hearing American small arms fire echoing through the streets behind them. A short time later, Friesenhahn detonated a small preliminary charge under the western approach ramp, blowing a 30-foot crater across the road to keep American tanks from rushing the span. And then nothing was working the way it was supposed to. A short time later, with Scheller, Friesenhahn and Bratge on the eastern shore near the railway tunnel, an American tank shell exploded close enough to knock Friesenhahn unconscious from the blast wave. When he came to, perhaps 15 minutes later, Bratge was screaming at him to fire the demolition. Friesenhahn refused without a written order from Scheller. Bratge ran to find Scheller, demanded the written authorization, brought it back. Friesenhahn turned the key. Nothing happened. The electrical circuit had been cut, possibly by American artillery fire, possibly by damage to the cable casing, possibly by sabotage from a foreign worker assigned to the engineer company. No one will ever know. The point is that at the most decisive moment, in front of one of the last intact bridges over the Rhine, the German demolition system, designed by professionals, supervised by an experienced engineer, produced under Hitler's terror of unauthorized destruction, simply did not work. A German non-commissioned officer named Anton Faust now did what Friesenhahn could no longer do from inside the tunnel. He ran out under American gunfire to the manual fuse cord on the southeast pier and lit it by hand. The 300 kilograms of weak industrial explosive went off. The bridge shook, smoke rose. Wood and steel flew in every direction, and when the smoke cleared, the Ludendorff Bridge was still standing. The damage was real. The eastern walkway was torn open, the deck was buckled, and the southeast pier had a great wound torn out of it. But the structure had not collapsed. The American officer at the head of the assault, Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, watched it through his field glasses and made the decision in his own mind that would define the rest of his life. He turned to his men, gave the order to advance, and started across. I want to pause here for a moment, because it would be easy to make this story about Lieutenant Timmermann. He is the kind of figure people like to make stories about. He had been born in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, in 1922. His father was an American occupation soldier who had gone absent without leave from the United States Army of the Rhine in 1921, married a German girl, and slipped his young family back into the United States in 1924 to settle in West Point, Nebraska. Karl was 22 years old on the day of the bridge. He had been promoted to acting commander of A Company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, 9th Armored Division only the day before, after his predecessor was wounded in the fighting outside the town of Meckenheim. He led that company across the bridge under heavy fire, with engineers behind him cutting wires and kicking demolition charges off the deck into the river. The first man across the river was a sergeant from Holland, Ohio, a 34-year-old named Alexander Drabik. Before the war, he had been a butcher, the youngest of 14 children of Polish immigrants who farmed near Toledo. Drabik later said that as he reached the eastern bank, a German soldier rose up and aimed a rifle at his chest at point-blank range, and then for some reason did not fire, lowered the rifle, and surrendered. Drabik was the first soldier of an invading army to set foot on the east bank of the Rhine since the Napoleonic era, more than a century earlier. If you have a moment to like this video, I would be grateful. It does not seem like much, a single click, but it is the only way the algorithm shows stories like this one to the people who care about them. The men I am about to describe to you are not in many history books. They were on the wrong side of the war and on the wrong side of their own command. Most of them are buried in graves marked only by a date. The least we can do, 81 years later, is keep their names where they can be found. Now. With the bridge standing, with American troops pouring across it, with German fire from the heights of the Erpeler Lay dwindling as one platoon of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion climbed straight up the cliff and silenced the flak guns at the top, the news began moving up the German chain of command. It reached Corps, it reached Army Group, it reached the headquarters of Field Marshal Walter Model, and then it reached Berlin. Adolf Hitler was at the Reich Chancellery when he was told. According to the testimony of officers who were in the room, he listened in silence for a long moment and then began to scream. The Ludendorff Bridge, he understood instantly, was a catastrophe. It was the first intact Allied bridgehead across the Rhine. It would let American forces pour into the heart of Germany weeks ahead of any rational schedule. Operation Plunder, Field Marshal Montgomery's elaborately planned crossing further north, was not scheduled to begin until March 23. The German plan had assumed that the Rhine would be a barrier, that there would be time, that the Western Allies would have to fight their way across the river the way every invading army for centuries had fought across it. All of that was now gone. By the morning of March 8, 8,000 American soldiers were on the east bank. 4 days later, there would be 6 divisions across, supported by additional pontoon and treadway bridges that American engineers had thrown up alongside the wounded original. By the time the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed under accumulated damage, about 6 divisions and roughly 125,000 troops had crossed. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, the American 12th Army Group commander, took the call about the bridge from 1st Army headquarters at his command post in Namur. By his own later account, his immediate reaction was the words, "Hot dog, this will bust him wide open." Bradley meant Hitler. The German general staff, listening to the same news reached them from the other direction, understood the same thing. What Hitler ordered next was the part that the field marshal we began with would, weeks later, call the crime. Hitler dismissed his commander-in-chief west, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the most senior soldier on the Western Front. He summoned Field Marshal Albert Kesselring from the Italian theatre and named him as the replacement. He ordered the use of V-2 ballistic missiles against Remagen, the only time those missiles would ever be aimed at a target inside Germany. The General Staff was horrified. The V-2 was a long-range strategic terror weapon designed for use against London. Its accuracy was so poor that the chance of hitting a specific bridge was virtually zero, while the chance of dropping a 1-ton warhead on German civilians was very high. 11 were fired on March 17 from a launch site at Hellendoorn in the Netherlands, about 200 kilometers to the north. The closest one missed by 270 meters. One missile drifted off course and hit Cologne, 64 kilometers from the target. Another struck a building in Remagen, serving as the command post of the United States 284th Engineer Combat Battalion. 3 American soldiers were killed in that single impact. By the end of the bombardment, 6 American servicemen were dead from the V-2 strikes alone, along with an unknown number of German civilians. That was not the worst of what Hitler ordered. The worst was that he summoned a man named Rudolf Hübner from the Eastern Front and gave him a title that had no precedent in German military law, commander of the Flying Special Court, Marshal West. The court would have its own portable execution squad. Hübner was, in the assessment of the American historian Charles MacDonald, a fanatical and reliable Nazi. He was a major general who in 1943 had circulated a memorandum on Nazi political education to the entire officer corps in 300,000 printed copies. He was promoted to Lieutenant General on March 1, 1945, 6 days before the bridge fell. He had no legal training of any kind. His civilian profession had been dentistry. He would act as both prosecutor and judge. The men he was sent to try had less than a week to live. The first to be tried, on March 13, in a country inn called the Gasthaus zur Linde in the village of Rimbach in the Westerwald Hills, were Major Hans Scheller and the Luftwaffe officer who had pleaded for time at the bridge, an Oberleutnant named Karl Heinz Peters. Scheller, the adjutant who had driven 64 kilometers through American positions to take command of a bridge he had never seen, who had hesitated to detonate it for the same reason every officer in the Wehrmacht was now hesitating, was found guilty of failing to destroy the bridge. He was 34 years old. Peters had pleaded for a few extra minutes to save a battery of secret anti-aircraft rockets, and was found guilty of delaying the demolition. He was younger than Scheller, the same age as the American lieutenant who had crossed the bridge the same day his country's case against Peters began. Both men were taken to a wood about a kilometer west of Rimbach and shot in the back of the neck. The next day, March 14, in another village inn in nearby Oberösen, Hübner's court tried 2 more officers. Major August Kraft commanded the engineer battalion that had been responsible for delivering the demolition supplies to Remagen. He was found guilty of failing to deliver enough military-grade explosives. Major Herbert Strobel was tried for ordering a counterattack against the American bridgehead that had failed. Counterattacks were failing all along the front by March 1945. He was no different from 100 other field-grade officers whose attacks had also collapsed. Both men were taken to a wood near Oberösen and shot. None of these officers had defense counsel. The trials themselves consisted of the defendants standing in front of a panel that included Hübner, while accusations were read at them. The men's military pensions, the only support their wives and children would have had after their deaths, were cancelled by order of the Reich. The pensions would be restored to the families only after the war, by the post-war West German government. In 1967, 22 years after the executions, a regional court at Landshut would issue a posthumous acquittal for all 4 men. By then, the only people the acquittal could comfort were children who had grown up on the social margins of post-war Germany because their fathers had been shot as traitors. 2 more officers were tried in absentia by Hübner's court because they had been captured by the Americans before the flying tribunal could reach them. Captain Willi Bratge was found guilty and sentenced to death. He survived because he was already in an American prisoner of war camp. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the engineer who had actually faced the broken circuit and demanded the written authorization, was acquitted by the same court that had sentenced 4 of his comrades to death. Both men learned what had happened only after the war, behind American wire. There was one further senior execution that needs to be told, because it shows the same pattern at a higher rank. General Major Richard von Bothmer, the battle commandant of Bonn, had given up that city without a major fight when the Americans broke through to the Rhine in early March. He was tried not by Hübner but by a different drumhead court under General Karl Püchler, the commander of the LXXIV Army Corps. The verdict came on March 10. Bothmer was demoted to private and sentenced to 5 years in prison. While the court was concluding its business, Bothmer reached for a pistol that belonged to one of the court officials. He shot himself in the courtroom. According to one witness, his suicide did not satisfy Hitler's bloodlust. This was what Field Marshal Albert Kesselring walked into on March 10, 1945. I want to say something about Kesselring, because he is the man at the center of the title of this video, and he was not a simple figure. He was a Luftwaffe field marshal who had spent most of the war commanding German forces in the Mediterranean and Italy. He was, for the general staff culture of the time, an unusual mind, an artillery officer who had pivoted into operational command, optimistic to a degree that earned him the nickname Smiling Albert from his Allied opponents. He was also, by the time he took over the Western Front, a man with serious crimes on his hands. After the war, he would be tried at Venice for ordering the Ardeatine massacre, in which 335 Italian civilians, including 75 Jews, were murdered in reprisal for a partisan attack in Rome, and for inciting and ordering broader reprisals against Italian civilians in villages such as Sant'Anna di Stazzema, Civitella, and Marzabotto. He was sentenced to death on May 6, 1947. The British government commuted the sentence to life imprisonment, and a sustained political campaign by senior British figures, including Winston Churchill, secured his release in October 1952 on grounds of throat cancer. He lived another 8 years and died in 1960. None of that should be ignored, but on March 10, 1945, Kesselring was being asked to do something specific. He was being asked to take command of an army that was disintegrating on a front that was breaking, with a Führer who was now executing his own commanders for failing to perform miracles. When he arrived at his new headquarters, by his own later account in the memoir he would write in 1953, he looked at his stunned staff and said, "Well, gentlemen, I am the new V-3. It was a joke, of a kind, about a doomed mission." The V-3, at the time he made the joke, was understood inside the German High Command as a colossal technical embarrassment. The original full-size weapon, the so-called high-pressure pump, had been built into a hillside fortress at Mimoyex in the Pas-de-Calais region of occupied France. It was designed to fire shells at London at a rate of hundreds per hour. It had never fired a shot at the British capital. The Allies had bombed the launch site into rubble with armour-piercing tallboy bombs in July 1944, and the advance through northern France had overrun what was left. A pair of shortened prototypes had been hastily emplaced at a site called Lamperden, in a wooded ravine inside Germany itself, and used to fire on Luxembourg City between late December 1944 and February 1945. Those guns had managed about 140 hits inside Luxembourg, killed roughly 10 people, and stopped firing only when American troops came within 3 kilometers of the launch tubes. Hardly a vengeance. By March 1945, the V-3 was a known German technical and strategic failure, a weapon that had absorbed enormous resources and produced almost nothing. To call yourself the new V-3 in front of your staff on the day you took over a collapsing front was to admit, dryly, that you had been put in charge of a project everyone in the room understood was already lost. But Kesselring did something else that week, and this is the part that makes the title of this video what it is. Speaking in his official capacity about the loss of the bridge itself, in the days after he took command, he used the German word Verbrechen, crime, to describe what had happened. He did not call it a defeat. He did not call it a setback. He used a word that, in any other context, would describe a deliberate moral wrong, and he was not talking about the Americans. To call the loss of a bridge a crime, when the bridge was lost in the middle of a fighting retreat by an army that had been ordered by its own dictator not to remove demolition charges until the enemy was within sight, and not to detonate without a written order, and to be court-martialed if either rule was violated, was to point a quiet finger upward. It was to say, the men who failed at Remagen were set up to fail. The system made it impossible for them to succeed, and then the system shot them for failing. Kesselring would never make that argument in those exact words, in public, in his lifetime. He was not that kind of officer. He served Hitler until the very end. He endorsed orders to hang deserters from the nearest tree. When a staff officer pointed out the hopelessness of the situation in late March, Kesselring said, in a sentence that would become infamous after the war, that he had driven through the entire army rear area and not seen a single hanged man. But that one phrase, the crime of Remagen, slipped out. It was the closest he ever came to saying out loud what the war had become. A regime executing its own captains for the consequences of a doctrine that the regime itself had imposed. If your father or grandfather served in the Second World War, in any unit, in any role, on any front, I would consider it a privilege to read about him in the comments. The unit. The dates. The battles. The story he told his family, or the story he never told. The official records are good, but they are not complete, and the personal details are how the rest of us remember. Those memories belong with the men who carry them, but the act of writing one down, where someone might read it, is itself a kind of preservation. Now I want to spend a few minutes on what the German army was, before all of this happened to it, because the contrast is the key to understanding why a senior officer would use a word like crime. By 1944, after the bomb plot of July 20, Hitler's trust in the German officer corps had collapsed. He had executed conspirators and their relatives in waves. He had posted notices around Germany listing the names of officers who had been killed for what he called treason. The lesson to every officer in the Wehrmacht was simple. Do not act on your own. Do not exercise judgment. Wait for an order in writing. If you act and you are wrong, you are dead. If you wait, you can at least... This was the army that took delivery, in October 1944, of a list of bridges over the Rhine, with instructions about when they could be wired, when they could be blown, and what would happen to any officer who got it wrong. The order was, on its face, a rational response to the accidental destruction of the Mülheim Bridge. It was also a death sentence for any officer in command of a bridge when the Americans arrived faster than expected. He would have to make a decision in seconds, with incomplete information, knowing that whichever way he chose, he could face a court-martial if the result was bad. Major Hans Scheller faced exactly that decision on the bridge at Remagen on March 7. He had arrived 3 hours before the Americans. He had not chosen the position, he had not built the defences, he had not selected the explosives, he had not commanded the men. He had inherited all of it, fresh out of a car that had been low on fuel, on a bridge he had never seen, with orders that he was not to detonate until the enemy was visible, and not without a written authorization that he himself was the only person in the chain of command authorized to write. When the moment came, he hesitated. When he stopped hesitating, the circuit was broken. Now consider Kesselring, looking at this on March 10. He had been a soldier his entire adult life. He had served as a general staff officer in the First World War. He had seen the Wehrmacht at its peak in 1940. He had watched it fight a long, grinding, attritional defense in Italy through 1943 and 44. He understood what it had meant to ask a 40-year-old captain on a railway bridge with 300 kilograms of weak industrial explosive to single-handedly stop the advance of the United States Army. And he understood what it meant for a regime to put that captain in front of a firing squad for failing. He did not become a critic of the regime. He did not refuse the assignment. He took the command, gave the V-3 quip to break the tension in the room, and went to work on a defense that he must have known by then was hopeless. But the word crime came out, once, about the bridge itself, and was recorded for posterity. It is one of the few moments in the historical record where a senior German military man, still in uniform, still serving, allowed himself to describe what was being done to his own officers in language that did not flatter the man giving the orders. What I want you to take from this, more than anything, is what happened to the men whose names do not appear in most accounts of the war. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were ordinary German officers, mostly men in their 30s and 40s, mostly veterans of the First World War and the early campaigns, who had been put in an impossible position by a chain of command that had been corrupted by fear from the very top. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the engineer who had asked for 600 kilograms of military-grade explosive and received 300 kilograms of industrial donerit, who had been knocked unconscious by an American shell, who had insisted on a written order before turning a key that would not work because the circuit had been cut, was tried in absentia by Hübner's court and acquitted. He survived the war as an American prisoner. In 1954, when the historian Ken Hechler interviewed him for his book on the bridge, Friesenhahn was asked what he thought of the American soldiers who had been decorated for the crossing he had failed to prevent. His answer, recorded verbatim, has been quoted in congressional records ever since. He said they had deserved their medals, and then some. He said they had seen his men trying to blow that bridge, and that by all the laws of probability the bridge should have collapsed underneath them while they were running across. In his mind, he said, they were the greatest heroes in the whole war. Captain Willi Bratge, the bridge security commander, was sentenced to death in absentia. He survived in American custody, returned to Germany after the war, and lived out his life in obscurity. Major Hans Scheller was 34 years old when he was shot on a hillside near Rimbach on March 13, 1945. He left a wife and a son. The son, Gert Scheller, would grow up under what one German newspaper later called an unspoken kin liability, refused entry to bomb shelters, ostracized by neighbors, told repeatedly that his father had been a coward and a traitor. The truth would come out only after the Landshut court's posthumous acquittal in 1967, 22 years too late. Oberleutnant Karl Heinz Peters had pleaded for time to save a battery of secret anti-aircraft rockets that he believed his country could not afford to lose. The plea cost him several minutes. The minutes cost him everything. Major August Kraft commanded an engineer battalion of older men, many of them too old for combat, who had been responsible for preparing the Rhine bridges for demolition. The supplies he was given for the job were inadequate. He was shot for the consequences of that inadequacy. Major Herbert Strobel was shot for ordering a counterattack that had failed at a moment in the war when counterattacks were failing every day on every front. These were the men Field Marshal Kesselring was thinking about when he allowed himself the words "crime of Remagen." The bridge had not been lost because they had failed. The bridge had been lost because the regime they served had spent 3 years systematically removing from its officers the very capacity to act independently that the German army had once made famous. The military verdict on the loss of the Ludendorff Bridge is not complicated. It saved the Western Allies between 2 and 6 months in the closing campaign of the war. Colonel F. Russell Lyons of the United States Third Corps Engineering Staff estimated, after the war, that it had saved the Allies about 35,000 casualties and roughly 2 months of fighting. General Eisenhower, in his memoir Crusade in Europe, called it one of those rare and fleeting opportunities which occasionally arise in war and which, if grasped, have incalculable effects on determining future success. In Allied interrogation, Hermann Göring conceded that the capture of the bridge had made a long defense impossible. The political verdict, which is the harder one to deliver, is the one Kesselring gestured at. The bridge was lost because of a chain of command that no longer functioned, because of a doctrine of fear that punished initiative, because of demolition charges that arrived in insufficient quantity and inferior grade, because of communications that took a day to complete a phone call, because of a transfer of command that arrived 3 hours before the enemy, because of an ordnance order that no officer could interpret in time to act, and because, in the end, an electrical circuit failed. There were 1,000 small reasons. Above all of them, there was a single large reason. The men who could have made decisions on the spot, in the way that German officers had once been trained to make them, had been turned over the previous 5 years into men who could only wait. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann walked across that bridge because his army still trusted him to walk across it. Major Hans Scheller did not blow it because his army had been taught, from the very top, that an officer who acted without orders would die for it. Both men were the products of how their respective armies had learned to organize themselves over the course of the war. One man, 22 years old, an immigrant son from a Nebraska town of 2,000 people, was given command of a company the day before the largest battle of his life and was trusted to lead it across a wired bridge under fire. The other, a 34-year-old major with years of staff experience, was given command of a critical strategic bridge 3 hours before the enemy arrived and was forbidden, by his own dictator, to act without written authorization that no one in the chain of command was alive or close enough to provide. The Ludendorff Bridge collapsed at about 3 in the afternoon on March 17, 1945, 10 days after it was captured. The cause was probably the cumulative damage from constant German bombing, the strain of heavy military traffic, the vibration from American anti-aircraft fire defending it, and the original blast damage from Friesenhahn's failed demolition all working together. About 28 American engineers from the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion and the 1058th Engineer Port Construction and Repair Group were on the bridge when it fell. Most drowned. 63 more were wounded. By that time, 3 pontoon and treadway bridges had been built downstream, 6 American divisions and roughly 125,000 troops with their tanks and artillery and supply wagons had crossed, and the bridgehead on the eastern bank could no longer be dislodged. The towers of the bridge are still there today. The town of Remagen never wanted the bridge rebuilt. They had not wanted it in the first place. In 1916, it had spoiled their view of the river, which was what tourists came to see. After the war, the western towers were preserved and turned, eventually, into a quiet museum. There is, on a wall in one of those towers, a framed canvas with a phrase from the Bible written on it in large black letters. "If God be for us, who can be against us?" It comes from the 8th chapter of the letter to the Romans. The American historian Ken Hechler, who fought in the United States Army through the Rhineland campaign and wrote the standard book on Remagen, recorded that the same phrase, framed in the same way, hung on the wall of one of the village inns in Westphalia, where Hübner's flying court tried and condemned the men who had failed to bring this bridge down. A coincidence that, for anyone who learned about it later, became impossible to forget. 2 German rooms, on opposite sides of the same week of the same month, decorated with the same words. In one, an American victory. In the other, a German firing squad. Captain Friesenhahn's 1954 assessment of the men who had taken the bridge from him, that they had been the greatest heroes in the whole war, comes the closest of any single line spoken by any participant to telling the truth of what happened. The men who took the bridge were brave. The men who failed to destroy it were not cowards. They were victims of a system that had chosen, year after year, to break them. A field marshal who walked into a collapsing front headquarters on March 10, 1945, and called himself the new V-3, knew that. He knew that the men who had failed at Remagen had been failed by their own command, long before they had failed in their orders. The word crime, when it slipped out of him later that week, was the closest he ever came to saying so out loud. He used it because it was the only word that fit. Not the crime of the Americans, who had won. Not the crime of his own soldiers, who had died for an impossible task. The crime of the regime that had set them up to fail, and then shot them when they did. If this story meant something to you, if these men and the impossible position they were placed in stayed with you for a few minutes after the screen goes dark, the like button helps more than you think. It is the difference between this story reaching 100 more people, or none. I would rather it reached 100 more. Subscribe for the next one. The catalogue of these stories is not small. Every campaign in this war had its men who were ordered into something they could not survive. And every campaign had a moment, somewhere in the records, where someone in command let a word slip that they were not supposed to say. The crime of Remagen was one of those moments. There are others. The men who died for that bridge, on both sides, were not paragraphs in a doctrine and were not statistics in a report. They had names. They had families. They had been told by their respective armies what kind of soldiers they were supposed to be. One was trusted to walk forward alone. The other was taught to wait for permission that never came in time. In the end, that was the difference. And it was, for the men who died for it, a much larger difference than any line on any map.